Before we begin tonight's quiet descent into forgotten corners of the past, tell me, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from? I love seeing how far these quiet histories travel. If this video helps you drift off or simply brings you a moment of stillness, gently tap the like button. Consider subscribing for more calming journeys into the strange, hidden layers of history. Now, let's begin. Asterisk, you're standing at the edge of the Mediterranean. The wind is salty and faint. The air thick with heat and the long-forgotten sound of sandals brushing across limestone paths. The year is 30 BCE. The city is Alexandria. But what you see before you is not a bustling Roman capital. It is a city, holding its breath, a city rearranged, not for commerce, not for war, but for a body. For her, by the time Cleopatra died, or was said to have died, Alexandria had already been transformed and would continue to change for centuries. Not because of her policies, not even because of her bloodline, but because of her memory, and the body no one could find. The last pharaoh of Egypt was, in truth, never buried in the usual way. Her tomb was never confirmed. Some say she was laid to rest beside Mark Antony in a chamber lined with gold leaf and sacred ibis feathers, far beneath the surface of Alexandria's royal quarter. But the city stones tell a different story. They do not celebrate her life. They trap it. When Augustus arrived in Egypt after her death, he was not just seizing a kingdom. He was seizing a symbol. He ordered the construction of new administrative quarters, military outposts, and temple facades, all tightly wound around the palace district where Cleopatra had lived, and possibly where she was buried. Streets were widened in places that led nowhere. Public squares were built over what might have been sacred gardens. Fountains were installed, but never flowed. Statues of Roman emperors were placed in patterns that avoided one certain corridor and narrow spine of earth where older Egyptian-era walls still stood buried beneath newer foundations. Nobody spoke of it, but architects avoided it. Builders circled around it. The city itself began to shape like a cage. It was not only physical. The memory of Cleopatra was partitioned, divided between the Greek-speaking elite and the Egyptian laborers. To one group, she was a seductive traitor. To another, a reincarnation of Isis. Either way, the city was no longer allowed to speak of her openly. Instead, they redesigned her. One curious piece of evidence comes from the Serapeum, a vast, columned temple to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. After her death, portions of the temple were repurposed. Kona, what had once been a chamber for holy texts, became a narrow gallery, empty, undecorated, and sealed at one end, not buried, just walled up. A Roman report from decades later describes a library vault no longer in use, wherein no flame may be brought. No flame, no oil lamp, no candle. A room not for the living, not for worship, just ... sealed. Was this the room? Was this the final attempt to erase a queen without removing her? Then there was the lighthouse, the great pharaohs, one of the 7 wonders. For centuries, the lighthouse marked the port, guiding sailors from all corners of the Mediterranean. But in the decades after Cleopatra's death, the area beneath the lighthouse was hollowed out. Some suggest it was for drainage or aqueducts, but others, especially during Napoleon's expeditions centuries later, noted how odd it was that the substructure was so vast, so empty. There were rumors among 18th century engineers that Roman vaults lie beneath the lighthouse foundations, too ornate for utility, too hidden for ceremony. Why build marble under a structure meant only to survive storms? In time, Alexandria became less a capital and more a tomb, a city of whispers. Its vibrant trade withered, its walls thickened, its street plans twisted into strange turns. Some streets ended in staircases to nowhere. Others looped around, as if avoiding something. All because of her. You see, when an empire wants to erase someone, it rarely removes them entirely. It builds around them. It layers stone over memory, okay? It replaces names, but not the foundations, okay? In Alexandria, the greatest effort was not to immortalize Cleopatra, but to trap her in body, in memory, in myth. A modern visitor might see only ruins now, but if you trace the shape of the streets, if you walk the city like water seeps through stone, you begin to notice something, a pattern, a quiet absence in the heart of the old city. A gap where nothing new was ever built. A space in the middle of everything designed not to protect, not to reveal, but to seal. And yet, the question lingers, soft as the sea air drifting in from the harbor. If they never found her tomb, then what exactly did they build the city around? Asterisk. It begins with silence. After Cleopatra's death, silence became law in Alexandria, not declared through edict, but maintained through architecture, routines, and quiet fear. Rome's victory was not just a military one, it was ideological. Okay, to own Egypt was one thing, but to silence its most powerful queen that required a deeper strategy. And so the city was reshaped, not as a monument, but as a labyrinth. The Roman governor Cornelius Gallus was appointed not long after Augustus declared Egypt his personal property. Gallus was not a local. He was not even a man of Alexandria. His role was to inspect, to reorganize, and to supervise the quiet erasure of the Ptolemaic world. But the task proved more delicate than anticipated. Because the body had not been found, this absence, the missing tomb, became an obsession. Even Augustus, when he visited her chambers, reportedly allowed himself a moment of softness, insisting she be buried as befits a queen. But where? Within months, engineers were dispatched to the palace district, to the old Ptolemaic structures. A strange blend of Greek and Egyptian styles were mapped, measured, then quickly overlaid with new Roman foundations. The plan was not to excavate. It was to cover, and several architectural scrolls recovered centuries later. Roman surveyors noted a peculiar instruction: preserve the base, do not disturb the lower stones. This was not due to reverence. Was fear of igniting a legend, because already rumors were circulating that Cleopatra's tomb was protected by divine curses, that her resting place would bring ruin to anyone who opened it. But practical reasons likely prevailed, as, well, removing her body, if it was still there, risked stirring unrest. Egypt was newly subdued and still volatile. Better, the Romans thought, to entomb the tomb itself. So the city grew. The street, known today as Junabi Daniel, may once have aligned with the ceremonial axis of the royal quarter, but Roman engineers redirected it, giving it a strange curve around the area believed to contain the queen's remains. In this way, roads became boundaries, alleyways narrowed, shrines were placed to block access, not to honor Cleopatra, but to stop the people from reaching what lay beneath. One such shrine, built in the 1st century CE and later misidentified as a temple to Isis, bears a strange inscription. Not a prayer, not a name, it's just a series of faintly carved words. She is not gone, only quiet. The Latin is awkward. It's possibly a poor translation from the Demotic tongue, but the message is unmistakable. This was not the only anomaly in the centuries that followed. Christian pilgrims who passed through Alexandria noted a forbidden sector near the old palace ground. Caves. One 5th century monk described it as a garden of marble that no one tends, where children are warned not to play. Another referred to a series of locked chambers with walls too thick for sound. Even after the great earthquake of 365 CE, which devastated much of Alexandria, that central zone remained strangely untouched. The rebuilding effort that swept through the city skipped over that quarter, as if waiting for permission that never came in the Islamic period. During the 9th and 10th centuries, Scholars of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad compiled strange accounts of Alexandria's lost tombs. A few referred obliquely to a place called Beit al-Malika, the House of the Queen. Not a palace, not a home, sealed vault. These sources describe an underground complex with corridors lined in brass and hidden from the sun, containing a woman who speaks without words. Most believe these were metaphors or poetic accounts filtered through centuries of storytelling. But the language is oddly consistent. Always underground, always sealed, always silent. In recent times, archaeologists have tried to piece together the puzzle. Subterranean surveys have revealed chambers beneath modern Alexandria that have never been excavated. They lie beneath modern buildings, under roads and walkways. Many of the areas are politically sensitive, others simply inaccessible. The weight of the city is literally in the way. Even more curious are the early underwater expeditions conducted off the coast of Alexandria in the 1990s and early 2000s. There, submerged beneath the modern harbor, divers discovered massive statues, columns, and remnants of palace walls, part of what is now believed to be the lost Ptolemaic Palace complex. Among the findings were two sphinxes and fragments of a black granite temple base, unlike anything else known in Roman Egypt. The orientation of the complex suggests it once extended inland toward what is now a crowded modern district. That area remains unexcavated. Some believe that, buried beneath it, is the chamber that held Cleopatra. But if the city was designed to protect it, to hide it, even from time, why would it ever reveal itself? A recent theory proposes that Cleopatra's tomb was intentionally designed to become untraceable. Key Egyptian temple builders, especially those with priestly roles, were known to build false chambers and sealed vaults meant only to be known by high initiates. If Cleopatra was buried by her loyal priests, perhaps they built such a system, and when the Romans arrived, they didn't remove it. They simply drowned it in stone. Today, if you were to walk the old city of Alexandria with this in mind, you might see things differently. You might notice how the oldest mosques avoid certain corners, how newer buildings slump just slightly along a forgotten line. You might hear stories, quiet ones, about places where compasses fail or dreams repeat. And then you might ask, did the Romans truly erase her? Or did they just give her the deepest chamber of all, the city itself? Asterisk, the oldest cities are made not just of stone and mortar, but of layers, not only of time, but of silence. In Alexandria, more than most, has become a city of layers, buried beneath mosques and shops. It's caught in the tangled roots of centuries of conquest and decay, lies a secret so carefully hidden that even history has learned to forget it. But still, it breathes in the 20th century. A new kind of exploration began in Alexandria, not with armies, nor with scribes, but with ground-penetrating radar and underwater sonar. The goal was clear: to trace the old city, to map what was once royal, sacred, and forbidden. What archaeologists found wasn't definitive proof of Cleopatra's tomb, but it was something almost stranger, an absence with edges in the heart of the city. Beneath layers of repaved streets and colonial-era storefronts, there is a zone, rectangular, irregular in depth, resistant to drilling and empty of usable utility lines. Technicians describe it as acoustically flat, a dead zone. No echo, no bounce, as if the earth had swallowed something and refused to speak of it again nearby. In the submerged ruins off the coast, the remains of Cleopatra's palace complex were confirmed. Gigantic red granite pillars, statue of a priest, possibly of Isis, and then a curious find: two statues, nearly 10 feet tall, believed to be Cleopatra and Mark Antony, standing side by side. The faces worn, the backs cracked, but the hands still close, still facing east. Because in Egyptian funerary tradition, The east was where the sun was born, the place of beginnings. If those statues were once near her tomb, they would not be placed to mourn, okay? They would be placed to guard rebirth. This brings us to the question that has quietly threaded itself through every layer of Alexandria's history. Is Cleopatra's body ever meant to be found? Some scholars believe the Romans simply lost track of her tomb. That chaos, reconstruction, and natural disaster erased all memory. That her story was overwritten by new emperors, new fates, new maps, but others, fewer, quieter, suggest that the city itself became her tomb. Not a single chamber, not a sarcophagus, but a perimeter, a negative space, design principle in ancient Egyptian architecture. There existed a concept known as the Geyser Jasiru, the Holy of Holies, referred to a sacred zone. So pure, so potent, that it could not be approached directly. You had to spiral toward it, had to pass layers of rooms, guardians, courtyards, shadows. It wasn't just about space, it was about preparation, about silence, about forgetting everything you knew before you reached it. In a way, Alexandria became one vast Geyser Jasiru, a sacred chamber without doors. Streets were reoriented, walls were thickened, shrines placed to redirect flow. Memory fractured, names changed. There are even whispers in Coptic Christian texts of a queen who sleeps in water, preserved not in a tomb, but beneath the surface, unreachable except by dreams. In local lore, children speak of a woman with gold around her neck who walks the harbor when the tide is especially low. Not as a ghost, as a guardian, but perhaps the most poetic clue came not from a tomb, nor a temple, but a coin. In 2007, a diver recovered a Romanera coin from the waters near the submerged royal quarter. The front bore the familiar profile Cleopatra, with her sharp nose, her layered crown, her gaze unflinching. But on the reverse side, instead of an eagle or cornucopia, common symbols of the Ptolemies, there was a wall, a simple line of stone blocks, interlocked with a single gap in the center. No inscription, no date. Some dismissed it as a forgery. Others claimed it was symbolic of Roman reconstruction, but a third theory, offered quietly in a footnote of an unpublished dissertation, suggested something else entirely, that the wall was not Roman, that the gap was not damaged, that it was a map of something sealed, not completely, not forever, just for now. And so we return to the modern city, to Alexandria today, vibrant, weathered, shifting underfoot. Tourists pass through. The historians argue. The ocean swells and retreats, and somewhere beneath the dust, the sound of sandals on stone still echoes faintly. If Cleopatra is there, she is not lost. She is not gone. She is simply beneath time, beneath noise, beneath memory that learned how to protect itself by forgetting. And if that silence is ever broken, if the city ever shifts just enough to whisper her name again, what story would arise with her? Would we finally see the tomb? Or would we only see the design that held her and realize we were inside it all along? It's asterisk in the stillness of a twilight sky over Tang Dynasty China. The air held a faint scent of incense and stone dust. The palace shimmered under layers of lacquered red and green. Its rooftops arched like waves about to crash, but everything remained perfectly still. You are in Luoyang, one of the great capitals of the ancient world. Tea and the walls are listening. The year is 690 CE. The empire has a ruler unlike any other, a woman named Wu Xiao, or as she would soon be known, Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to formally rule as emperor in her own right. But her power was not cemented through mere declarations or elegant scrolls. It was carved into the bones of the capital and hidden behind its walls. In ancient China, cities were symbols of cosmic order. Walls weren't just practical defenses. bait with statements, maps of power, authority, and control. Ku, who had clawed her way to the throne in a court of scholars. Monks, generals, and concubines understood that to truly rule must first reshape space itself. The palace complex in Luoyang had been designed for emperors, for men, but as Wu took control, it slowly began to shift. Brick by brick, room by room, new chambers were added. Some expanded the imperial residences, others were storage or study halls, but some were odd, silent, unused, locked by the time visitors entered the court to pay tribute to the empress. They were already walking through her trap of space, carefully engineered to misdirect, observe, and quietly contain, according to later chroniclers, many of whom resented her. Wu ordered that certain walls be thickened with hollow seams. These weren't structural flaws, they were cavities. Inside some of these spaces, narrow wooden corridors were inserted, just wide enough for a man to walk single file. Some had slits like arrow loops, others had none at all. The empress, it was said, had created a palace within the palace, a place where shadows moved behind walls. It's a place where an army could exist, unseen. Why? Because power like hers attracted enemies, scholars who hated her ambition, monks who questioned her reforms, generals loyal to her late husband. Wu was always being watched. So she built a palace that could watch back in the Hall of Heavenly Justice, one of the throne rooms rebuilt under her orders. Visiting officials often remarked on the strange acoustics. Some rooms echoed faintly, even when empty. Others swallowed sound completely. In some chambers, whispers traveled farther than footsteps. And always, there were servants who seemed to appear from nowhere. At the time, these oddities were attributed to superstition. Later, historians accused Wu of paranoia, of surrounding herself with spies. But the architecture tells another story. Few surviving schematics, preserved in calligraphy manuals from later dynasties, show cross-sections of interior walls with strange compartments, not rooms, not closets, but watching posts. Some even had laddered access to upper levels, away from any roof or visible floor. And then there are the rumors. During Wu's reign, political purges were common, but rarely public officials would simply disappear. Sometimes after a private audience, sometimes during dinner. A chancellor might be sipping tea at dusk and vanish before sunrise. No record, no procession, no corpse. It was as if the walls themselves had swallowed them in time. Stories emerged of a hidden corps, men trained not only in combat, but in silence. They were known as the Yin Wei, or shadow guards, never named in official records, never honored in sculpture. They existed, if at all, only inside the walls. Their quarters were part of the palace, their eyes behind the panels, their ears behind the lattice. Asterisk. One monk who served at the White Horse Temple nearby wrote, "To see the Empress is to see 1,000 eyes behind her." He also recorded a strange dream that while meditating, he saw a crack in a palace wall open like a mouth, and from it emerged a man in armor with no face. Today, we might call this folklore, a metaphor. But when archaeologists studied the substructure of the Luoyang Palace site in the late 20th century, they found hints that some walls were not entirely solid. Ground scans revealed voids, not accidental air pockets, but spaces, shaped deliberately. No entranceways, just hollows. And what's more, some of these hollows connected in paths. They formed lines that curved around key areas, the Empress's private chambers, the Hall of Edicts, the pavilion where foreign ambassadors were received. The city of Luoyang had always been proud of its symmetry, a city built like a scroll, wide avenues, ceremonial gates, orderly gardens. But Wu made use of this structure in a different way. She reinterpreted it in Chinese geomancy or feng shui. Space carries meaning. A curve is not just aesthetic, it's a redirection of energy. A gateway is not merely an entrance, it's a filtering device for influence. Wu's architects, under her orders, adjusted the palace to absorb movement, to cushion noise, to hide. Every stone became part of a larger pattern, one where people walked forward, but never saw behind. Even her most trusted ministers began to grow uneasy. One record from the court annals noted that an advisor had expressed concern about the whispers within walls. He was demoted the next day. No explanation, and then nothing. No rebellion inside the palace walls ever succeeded. No assassin ever reached her chambers. No soldier ever penetrated the central court. For over a decade, Wu ruled not by might alone, but by making the very city listen for her. Or, perhaps, speak for her. But the most chilling record comes from after her death, years later, during a renovation under the Tang Restoration. Workers dismantled a damaged wall in the palace courtyard. Behind it, they found a passage, narrow, dusty, lined with rotting boards. At its end, a bench, a spear, and armor, still folded, still waiting. What kind of city keeps its guards inside the walls? Okay? And what kind of empress designs a palace that doesn't just protect her body, but absorbs every sound that might betray her name? Okay. Asterisk, by the 7th year of Empress Wu's reign, the palace had become a living organism. It breathed not through windows, but through gaps. It saw not with eyes, but with sound. And those who entered it, even those of high rank, quickly understood that the walls were not simply made of wood and stone. They were made of memory. And memory, under Wu, was a weapon. The hidden compartments she had built throughout the damning palace were not haphazard. Okay, they followed rules, ancient ones, in old military treatises dating as far back as the Warring States period. There were instructions for how to build false floors, whispering halls, and concealed barracks. Wu revived them, not because she expected war, but because she had lived through the quiet kind, the kind that unfolds in glances, messages, and half-truths passed down corridors. She knew her own rise had been improbable. She had entered the court as a concubine of Emperor Taizong, and later became the consort and then wife of his son, Emperor Gaozong. But it was after Gaozong's death that her legend truly took root. Many expected her to retire. Instead, she maneuvered her way through layers of resistance ministers, clans, priests, until she declared herself emperor in her own name. It had never been done before, and so she made sure it would never be undone. She instructed engineers to redesign the flow of movement within the court. Halls, once aligned for ceremonial clarity, were redirected for surveillance. Halls were doubled in width, not to withstand siege, but to allow for secret footsteps. One scroll describes a worker who was called to fit bricks over a passage, but not shown where it led. He was blindfolded before and after the job. The result was a palace where every surface might contain someone, every silence might be occupied. And over time, it's changed how people behaved. Officials began to speak differently, choosing words carefully, avoiding direct references to faction or lineage. Courtiers learned to bow slightly toward empty walls, just in case. Even petitions became indirect, filled with coded metaphors. Bamboo, representing honesty. Lotus, symbolizing silent loyalty, because no one knew where the walls ended, who might be behind them. A strange kind of etiquette evolved. Those who served in the court long enough developed what historians later called the whispering walk, a way of moving slowly, keeping eyes low and speaking into sleeves. It was not merely courtly behavior. It was survival. We know this because a few accounts, long buried, escaped censors. One from a eunuch named Z, you later transcribed during the Song Dynasty, describes his experience delivering messages between chambers. I walked the Red Hall at noon, he writes, and heard breathing that did not match my steps. I paused, thinking it a trick of wind, but then it paused with me. Another account, preserved in fragments, refers to guards who do not belong to the outer registry. They were not on official rosters, no insignia, no family name. They answered only to the empress, and sometimes not even aloud. One tapped messages through beams, a language of knocks and rhythm, almost musical. These men were her silence. But what's perhaps more remarkable is how she trained the walls to outlive her, ordered that certain corridors be sealed upon her death, not torn down, not reused, just closed. Some say it was to prevent her enemies from discovering her hidden defenses. Others believe it was spiritual part of a belief system that required the containment of her legacy in wood and stone. Not just scrolls. In the 9th century, during a brief rebellion that swept through Luoyang, rebel soldiers broke into parts of the old court, looting chambers and setting fires. But one section, the northern quarter of the palace, remained untouched, not because it was better defended, but because none could enter. The walls, they said, had no doors. A Tang poet, Du Qi, later composed a verse about this. The hall, where echoes waited still / holds breath behind its seal of will. No fire takes, no voice awakes. The empress watches, silent still. It is not just poetry. It is history shaped by fear. Archaeological teams in the modern era have tried to reach these areas, but political instability, urban overgrowth, and historical erasure have made access nearly impossible. Still, ground scans hint at what lies below: stone-lined rooms without air shafts, hallways that appear to end in solid ground, pressure voids behind ancient foundations. In one area, under what was once the Hall of Auspicious Dew, modern instruments detected an anomaly. A long chamber, 40 feet in length, only 4 feet wide. No entrances, no records, no known function. What was it for? The leading theory: movement, quiet, internal movement, a passage between judgment and execution, a place for decisions to move invisibly. If this is true, then Empress Wu did not just build a palace to rule from. She built a mechanism, a machine of governance, one that processed power, filtered it, concealed it, and released it only when necessary. Every corridor was a nerve, every chamber a memory cell. This, perhaps, is the most astonishing part. Long after her death, the court continued to function as she had designed it. The layout persisted. The caution remained. Even emperors who hated her methods found themselves trapped in her geometry. The space she built shaped their behavior. Long after her name was removed from official histories, even when her story was buried, her city kept teaching the lesson. Rule not by sword nor scroll, but by design. Design the very way people walk, where they pause, how they breathe. Because sometimes all it takes to control history is a wall that listens longer than any memory can speak. Asterisk, by the time Empress Wu died in 705 CE, the palace was no longer hers, and yet it still spoke with her voice. The court officials who had once whispered her praises now whispered of her removal. Her name was stripped from monuments. Her titles revised in official records. In some scrolls, she was demoted back to Xiaoyi, a concubine's rank. In others, her rule was omitted entirely, as though 15 years of emperorship had simply not occurred. But even as the ink changed, the walls did not. Wu Zixin's physical presence had vanished, her body entombed in the kindling mausoleum, buried beneath twin stone guardians, her tomb inexcavated to this day, but her architectural presence remained. Her design lingered not only in the hallways, but in how people behaved inside them. Asterisk, for generations. Emperors who ruled from the same palace found themselves following paths she had set, literal ones: the winding corridors, the concealed alcoves, the asymmetries of the throne halls. none were removed, in part because they were too deeply embedded, but also because no one fully understood how they worked. Even those who tried to renovate found themselves tracing outlines they could not erase. Asterisk. A few dared. Emperor Zhongzong, restored to the throne after Wu's death, attempted to purify the palace, to tear down parts of her extensions, open the sealed corridors, let in light. But it didn't last. Political unrest, rival factions, and constant rumor made the court too unstable. The walls, as it turned out, still served a function. They filtered information. They controlled space. They preserved power. And so, the rooms remained. Centuries later, during the Song dynasty, an archivist named Chen Yu described his visit to the palace ruins in Luoyang. He wrote, "I walked the old halls with a map in one hand, yet the air in the rooms taught me more than parchment. There were turns that should not exist, doors with no outer frames, a stillness in certain walls that made one feel ... noticed." Concluded that the empress had not only ruled by law, but by layout, that her greatest edict was not written, but embedded in wood and stone, in a forgotten architectural text from the Liao dynasty. A section describing Tang palace planning contains this cryptic annotation: to preserve control, use the empress's rule. Build one door fewer than needed. Light only what you wish to be seen. Leave space for breath behind every wall. Whether this is directly attributed to Wu or not, the implication is clear. She left behind not just a system, but a set of principles, a ghost of spatial strategy. Modern researchers working with satellite imagery and non-invasive ground-penetrating scans have reconstructed parts of Wu's Luoyang Palace layout. It reveals an intriguing pattern: 3 concentric layers around the empress's throne chambers, not perfectly circular, not square, as if the throne were a dropped stone, and the architecture its echo dot in each ring. A different kind of space. Outer ring, ceremonial halls, libraries, public courtrooms, spaces for display, for illusion. Middle ring, service corridors, storage, scribe rooms, spaces for movement, for function. Inner ring, private paths, hidden rooms, shadow passages, spaces for watching, for memory. It is this inner ring that scholars still debate, not because of what it contained, but because of how little it contained. No paintings, no inscriptions, just empty rooms. Or perhaps not empty, just silent. And it's here the final thread of the story tightens, not around the empress herself, but around the idea of a palace as a mind. In Chinese philosophy, particularly in Taoist metaphysics, there exists the concept of wu-wei action through non-action. Influence not through force, but through presence. Wu's palace may have embodied this. A city designed not to command, but to suggest, not to oppress, but to observe. And by observing, to shape. People who lived in her palace adjusted their voices, their steps, even their thoughts, not because Allah told them to, but because the space invited it, expected it, and punished deviation in silence. This was her genius. She did not build an army. She built an atmosphere, and once created, atmospheres are hard to destroy. Today, tourists who visit Luoyang see only fragments, foundations, museum exhibits, carved stone lions eroded by centuries. But if you walk the grounds slowly, if you look at the angles of shadow at certain hours of the afternoon, you may sense something deeper, a whisper of geometry, a logic in the dust, an echo in the brick. And if you pause, if you find yourself turning gently without reason to glance behind, then perhaps the Empress's palace is still working, still shaping, still waiting, because Wu Zixin may have died, but her city never truly served anyone else. It still walks her halls. It still listens. And somewhere beneath the layers of ceremony and time, chamber still sealed might be holding breath. A single door, closed not to keep someone in, but to keep her memory from getting out. Asterisk, the city of Constantinople in the 9th century was a place of thresholds. Thresholds between East and West, between holiness and empire, between the seen and the buried. Its walls did not just protect the city, they arranged its memory. Every street, every chapel, every archway told a story. But hidden among them, just behind the monastery of studios, stood a structure that told no story at all. A tall, windowless building that appeared overnight and was never questioned. The locals called it the quiet house, but it was no house, and its silence was not peace. It was punishment. The woman at its center was known only by a single name, Theodote. She was not born a threat. She was born into a merchant family near the Golden Horn, educated in scripture, trained in embroidery. 15, she entered the monastery, not for sin, but for status. Families offered daughters to convents as symbols of piety, placing them in orders tied to powerful families. Theodote's order, though small, was tied to the Empress Theodora herself, a woman both devout and shrewd, ruling during a time of theological fracture. Theodote had no intention of disrupting that balance. She prayed, she stitched, she fasted. But then she did something unexpected. She wrote, not letters, not diaries, but visions, detailed descriptions of dreams she claimed came from God. In these dreams, she described the city falling into fire, churches crumbling into the sea, and a woman in royal robes casting down false priests. At first, they were shared only among sisters, but word spread, and so did copies. It was not the content that disturbed the court. It was the clarity, the precision, and the timing, because at the very moment her visions were being whispered among nuns and scribes. A faction of iconoclasts was rising again. Those who opposed religious icons, paintings of Christ, Mary, and the saints, wanted to strip churches bare, and Theodote's visions, unintentionally or not, became symbols of resistance. She became dangerous, but she was not arrested. She was not exiled. Instead, the emperor ordered a new enclosure be built for her contemplation. That was the official phrasing. But what was constructed was no convent, no chapel. It was a 3-story stone block, featureless, windowless, with a single iron door and a tiled roof too steep to climb. Theodote was placed inside, alone, and then the real construction began. Over the next 6 years, buildings rose around it. A watchtower, a granary, a barracks, a small chapel, all surrounding that original cell. The quiet house was no longer quiet. It had become the nucleus of a military outpost, not defending a border, but enclosing a woman. Theodote was not forgotten. Letters continued to circulate in her name. Some were copied from memory. Others were smuggled out, written in charcoal on cloth. One described her cell of bones, where the walls wept in winter, and the air tasted like candle ash, and yet she endured. According to an 11th century chronicle discovered in Mount Athos, the guards posted near the quiet house began to fear her, not because she screamed, but because she did not. Even in storms, even during sieges, her cell remained, still dry, unmoving. Pilgrims began to visit, not to see her, for she was unseen, but to walk the walls around her. They traced the outer circle of the fortress like a labyrinth, whispering prayers. The military tried to prevent this, but the more they pushed, the more people came, and with them, stories. They said that Theodote had turned to stone, that her body no longer needed food, that her eyes had turned inward and could see the sins of those who passed. Some claimed to hear a faint chanting from inside the walls, even when no one was near. One particularly vivid account comes from a monk named Germanos, who claimed that the very layout of the fortress changed during his visit. He described approaching from the south gate, turning left to reach the granary, and finding himself back where he started. No memory of retracing his steps. He wrote, "The air bends there. The stones speak to one another." I did not see her, but I felt seen, not judged, not blessed, only known. The most fascinating element of the fortress was that no map ever matched it. Records from the Imperial Archives list the location under 3 different names. The military called it Clysora, the Lock. The clergy called it Mon Apophatic, the Unspeaking Monastery. Locals called it simply her ring. But none agreed on its size. Some described it as no larger than a villa. Others said it had chambers that extended underground, connected by vaulted tunnels. Few claimed it had a well that sang in different tones, depending on who drew water. Always rumors, never proof. By the time the empire shifted its focus to new threats, Arabs to the east, Bulgars to the north, the quiet house had become a kind of relic, no longer guarded, no longer feared, just avoided. But Theodote remained. When she died is uncertain. Some say she passed peacefully, seated upright, still wrapped in the same veil she entered with. Others say her body was never found, that the door was opened and only a folded robe remained. What is certain is this: the cell was sealed. A bronze plate was set into the floor outside the door, inscribed with a single word in Clesis, the Greek, for shutting in, or, more literally, a binding. And then, one by one, the buildings around the cell were abandoned. The barracks emptied. The tower crumbled. The chapel roof fell. But the original cell, her quiet house, stood. Even in Ottoman times, it remained untouched. Locals built around it, never over it. A spice market was once erected on the same hill, but the merchants left the square plot alone. No one could explain why today, beneath the cluttered streets of modern Istanbul, archaeologists believe that foundation may still exist, a sealed chamber beneath a parking lot or an apartment block, forgotten by records, remembered only in angles. And when asked why the Byzantines built a fortress around a single nun, most historians will speak of heresy, of containment, imperial fear. But perhaps the better question is not what they were keeping in, but what, after so many layers of silence, they were hoping would never get out. Theodote's name had long since disappeared from the imperial rolls by the time the fortress around her cell began to deteriorate. But in the minds of those who passed by, she was more present than ever. Like a knot in the fabric of the city, her absence pulled tightly on memory. The fortress had been built to hide her, yet with each generation, she became more visible, not in body, but in shape. It began with the way people walked. Pilgrims, merchants, and even imperial messengers took longer routes to avoid the direct path around the quiet house, some out of reverence, others out of fear. Children were warned not to play near its foundations. Arcade vendors placed their stalls deliberately off-center, creating a subtle bend in the city's commerce. Even priests, usually precise in their processions, curved their routes ever so slightly away from the site. Nev, naming it aloud, but one group refused to avoid it. Onograpphers. In the decades after the great iconoclast controversy had settled and painted icons returned to public worship, some artists began depicting female saints in strange ways, without faces, or with veils that resembled stonework. One icon, now cracked and faded, shows a woman seated behind a lattice of bricks, her hand raised in blessing, yet partially obscured, as though viewed through a wall. It bears no name, no halo, no inscription. Only a single word along the bottom: Makrubtin, do not hide. Scholars debate the meaning. Some say it was a theological warning, a veiled critique of imperial censorship. Others believe it's an unspoken acknowledgement of Theodote, the woman no one was allowed to name, yet who had shaped an entire quarter of the capital. Even stranger, worth of floor plans, surviving blueprints from nearby buildings, churches, bathhouses, storehouses, show intentional asymmetries when viewed from above. The western foundations of the basilica near the site do not match its eastern wing. The archways bend unnaturally, as if diverted by a force not shown on paper. But when overlaid with the rumored perimeter of the quiet house, the distortions align perfectly. Space itself seemed to bend around her. And then there are the letters, smuggled fragments, preserved in monasteries as far away as Thessaloniki and Sinai, though attributed to different names: Kazan, Theophano, Anna the recluse. The voice remains the same, controlled, sparse, precise, and always speaking from within. One letter reads, "I do not sleep as you sleep." The stone teaches stillness. It is the fourth prayer of the day, and the candle burns low. I do not light it for God. I light it so the wall remembers me. Another, written decades later in the same hand. They built a chapel, but the altar faces the wrong way. I have not seen the sun in 40 years, but I still know which way it rose when I entered. Was it truly Theodote? Did she survive for decades in a sealed cell? Or were her letters copied, extended, given new life by those who needed her to live on? One theory suggests that she became a symbol for a hidden order of female ascetics who modeled themselves after her, not just in piety, but in architecture. Hermitages that mimicked her stone cell began to appear across Anatolia and the Balkans, always square, always windowless. Some even had false walls built inside, narrowing the space further so that the nun inside would never touch the outer surface. Austere, yes, but also a kind of reverence, as if, by limiting space, they preserved memory more efficiently in this period. A new phrase entered Byzantine ecclesiastical vocabulary: kerygma, lithanon, the stone proclamation. It referred to silent witness, testimony given, not in words, but in structure. Some believed it referred to churches, others to martyrdom, but a few whispered it was about her, because something happened after Theodote's cell was sealed. The walls did not crumble. They did not sag with time. Unlike the tower that fell in an earthquake or the granary burned in a riot, her cell endured. Even after centuries, the stone blocks remained aligned, unmoved, untouched. When Ottoman builders later cleared the hill to construct barracks in the 16th century, they avoided the rectangular base in the center. According to one source, they called it the Breathless House. They believed it was cursed, not haunted, just full of something that should not be disturbed, full of someone who had filled the walls with waiting. And it wasn't just superstition. One Ottoman court scribe, Mehmed Efendi, recorded in his diary that soldiers who attempted to break the seal reported hearing a voice of weeping limestone. No human voice, stone, flexing and clicking as if readjusting itself. They abandoned the effort, and the outline of the cell was once again left alone. Mapped, but never explored. Modern historians, trying to trace the location, note how odd it is that no major structures ever succeeded on that plot. A dozen buildings were proposed, none completed. Each plan dissolved before execution, the funds diverted, the materials misplaced. Even now, the land remains occupied but nondescript. The shape remains, not in bricks, but in blueprint refusals. What does this tell us? That Theodote's imprisonment was never only about her body. It was about the threat of space, the fear that a woman's presence, her ideas, her silence, could rewire a city, not with violence, not with spectacle, but with stillness. The fortress that grew around her was never truly for her. It was for everyone else, to remind them that some ideas cannot be killed, only buried, and even then, they might still rise, not with words, but with angles. And so we are left with her outline, a shape in the stone. A woman who vanished without leaving, who bent space so completely that history could only describe her in what it avoided. Was she imprisoned? Or did she, brick by brick, imprison the memory of an empire that feared her silence more than her speech? Asterisk in the end, the adult became less a person and more a phenomenon. She had entered the monastery to serve, a quiet, obedient figure. But when her words began to spread, her visions to echo through forbidden corridors, the state did what it had always done with dangerous ideas. It enclosed them. But unlike other prisoners, the adult did not protest. She did not cry out. She entered the stone willingly. And then she did something no one expected. She stayed, not for days, not for months, but for decades. And the city changed shape around her. The quiet cell she was placed in became the gravitational center of a fortress. Then a legend, then a void, so thick with meaning that it bent space around it. If her body was ever found, no record survives. If the door was ever opened, no witness spoke. But the absence itself became undeniable. In Constantinople's late Byzantine period, a new wave of mysticism began to surface among the anchorites, the Christian hermits who retreated from society. Many began to cite not Theodote's words, but her outline. They would build small shrines, no larger than a single bed, with a narrow slit for food and no door at all. One such structure, preserved in northern Greece, still holds an inscription, carved in ash wood. I do not seek freedom, I shape it from the inside. There were rumors, even centuries later, of her voice appearing in visions, not through spoken words, but through the shifting of walls, the changing of floor plans, the strange bends in alleyways. One mystic claimed that in prayer he saw a city without windows, where every building contained a memory. And at the center sat a woman sewing walls with her fingers, whether real or imagined. It's clear that Theodote created something larger than herself. Her sealed cell was copied in mosaics across Bulgaria and Macedonia, always shown as a perfect cube, floating alone, surrounded by stylized flames or water. In one monastery, a monk even painted her name backwards, mirrored in gold tile. Why? Because he believed her presence could only be seen indirectly, never head on. And as centuries passed, the structure became a touchstone for stories about what it meant to disappear completely and still remain. Writers called it the fold, the stone skin, the living absence, and still, too, no one could quite say what was inside. In the 19th century, when European travelers passed through Istanbul, a few recorded references to the unmappable square, a patch of ground that seemed to repel construction, where even weeds grew at a slant. Some architects tried to survey it, but their instruments gave inconsistent readings. Compass needles shifted, plumb lines curved. One man, a French engineer named Dufford, wrote in his notebook, I have built over hills and rivers, but never have I measured a flat surface and found its memory taller than myself. His sketches show faint outlines, a structure beneath the earth, 20 feet square, with triple thick walls in a hollow center. No entrance, no break, it's density. And here is where the historical trail goes quiet again. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps what Theodote built was never meant to be found. Perhaps her silence was never punishment, but architecture, a living protest in stillness. A kind of sacred geometry designed not for escape, but for integration, for inhabiting absence as a form of truth. And so we return to the present asterisk. In Istanbul today, city planners still navigate strange curves around a certain slope in the old Fatih district. Streets bend without cause. A patch of earth resists plumbing. Old maps don't match. Developers complain that permits fall through. Mysteriously, residents say nothing, only that it has always been this way. There's a narrow side street, unmarked, where the sidewalk rises slightly before leveling again. If you walk it slowly, you may feel something underfoot, a pattern you can't quite name, a shape you never stepped fully into, okay? A breath that doesn't belong to the air. And you may wonder, what kind of woman could be erased so thoroughly from history, yet still shape the angles of the city that tried to forget her? Theodote did not write her own hagiography. She wrote nothing after the walls were sealed, and yet her silence survived the empire, not in books, not in monuments, but in a cell that became a symbol, in a city that bent itself around her like a cloak, in every unbuilt structure that left space for her to remain. And perhaps that is the true miracle, not that she was hidden, but that history still speaks her name through the places where it refuses to build. Asterisk, the name of the town was Darianahida, though most maps shortened it to Darren, a simple name. Modest, it meant the gate of Anahita. Anahita, the goddess of waters, fertility, and escape. But no river flowed near the town. No spring fed its walls. The air was dry, high, and flat. And the town itself was not built for worship. It was built for memory, or more precisely, to trap it. Located on the trade road between Ecbatana and Susa, deep within the western folds of the Sassanid Empire, Darren was never a capital, never a fortress. It did not sit near a border or a river or a hill. It sat, instead, in a deliberate emptiness, miles from anything of tactical or agricultural value. And yet, the town existed. Walls, watchtowers, temples, gates, but all of it had been built for someone who never returned. Her name was Shabahang, though in the imperial scrolls she is often referred to only by title, Cademus Evamin, the third attendant. She was a concubine of a prince named Artavan, a younger son of Shah Kuzarai, and according to the rare letters that mention her, she was not selected for her beauty or lineage, but for her voice. Shabahang was a singer, not for performance, not for courtly display, but for private prayers. She was raised in a Zoroastrian fire temple, trained to chant the goddess, the sacred hymns, with precise tone and resonance. The voice was considered a vessel of purity. The prayers had to be carried, not just recited. When Prince Artavan visited the temple as part of a seasonal pilgrimage, he heard her singing through the fire screens, not seeing her, only sensing her cadence, and he ordered her brought to the palace. She did not resist. Not at first. Palace life in Ctesiphon, the capital, was structured, ritualized. For a concubine, there were schedules, prayers, meals, embroidery, instruction. Hank violated one of the unspoken rules. She kept singing, not the required prayers, not the court verses, but her own dot in the margins of fire temple scrolls, now stored in the National Library of Iran. A brief note survives, likely scribbled by a novice monk. She sings, "The road open, no walls stop her." And in time, that's exactly what she tried to do, according to the poet Firuz Banu, whose 10th century work, The Song of the Unopened Gate, references Shabahang indirectly. The concubine escaped during the night of Ahura stars, an observance of divine fire, when lamps were lit and courtyards burned with reflected light. The tale says she disappeared through the outer walls, guided only by sound. That she had memorized the guards' routes by listening to their steps. That she had tied pebbles to the hem of her robe so that her own movement could be traced by rhythm. A trick learned from temple dancers who mimicked rainfall in performance. She headed west, not toward her homeland, not toward a city, but toward open land. And somewhere in that wide emptiness, she vanished. She was never recaptured. No body was found. No letter from her was ever intercepted. But what came next was stranger. Prince Artavan, heartbroken or humiliated, the records are unclear. ordered a town to be built at the midpoint between Ctesiphon and her last known location. He called it Hita, a gate for a goddess. But it was not a shrine, it was a net. The layout of the town was circular, unusual for Persian cities of the time. Concentric roads, low walls, echo chambers. Every structure was designed to reflect footsteps. Courtyards were paved with bricks that clicked when stepped on. Doorways were narrow, designed to catch loose fabric, okay? And central to it all was a raised platform, not a throne, a stage. The town had no central market, no governor's quarters. Instead, it had a performance hall, open air, surrounded by walls that distorted sound. It was here, they said, that Artavan waited each solstice, listening, hoping her voice would return. Locals believed the town was cursed, not with evil, but with listening. People whispered that if you spoke too loudly and daring, your words would echo back at night, altered. That the wind did not whistle, but hummed. That if you left your door open during prayer, the sound of another voice would answer faint, precise, and always singing in a tongue no longer used. And yet, no ruler ever dared to demolish it, even during the Arab conquests. Darin was left mostly untouched. Caliphate records described it as a town that repeats itself, a circular plan, a name without a founder, and always the sound. Ottoman records, centuries later, dismissed the place as a ruin of memory, yet advised builders not to disturb its inner circle. One Turkish architect wrote, "The walls sang, not in joy, in search." In the 19th century, a French archaeologist named Jules Verrier visited the site and was struck by the acoustics. In his journal, he writes, "I clapped my hands beneath the central arch. The echo returned 5 times, not diminishing, but growing clearer. On the 5th return, I heard my own voice call my name, not in French, in a dialect I had never learned." He left the next morning. Modern satellite imagery of the ruins reveals the peculiar structure, a spiral overlay within a circle, mathematically elegant, but unnecessarily complex for a desert settlement. Acoustic engineers have mapped the resonance, points places where whispers carry from one edge to another across impossible distances. Why? Because Darin was never meant to be a town for living. It was built as a gate, not for entry, but for waiting. Waiting for a sound, for a return, for a woman who was never meant to be found, but whose voice refused to be forgotten. And so the town remains, not bustling, not abandoned. It's paused, like an instrument that was strung, tuned, but never played again. And if you stand in the center today, just before dawn, before the desert wind rises, you might hear a single note travel the length of the street, a note that never ends, 'cause it was never allowed to begin. Asterisk by the 2nd generation after its founding. Hita had already slipped from imperial priority into myth. It remained on maps. Taxes were collected. Occasionally, a single garrison was stationed in the outer circle. But no new construction was permitted near its core. Not by imperial decree, but by silent agreement. There were no laws governing it, no penalties for violating the boundaries, yet no one ever did. The people who lived there, artisans, caretakers, guards, wanderers who settled out of exhaustion rather than ambition, called themselves Senemi Garden, the Circle, Walkers, not because they believed in Shabahangs, legend necessarily, but because the town encouraged a particular kind of movement, a strange, soft repetition, paths that turned inward, conversations that spiraled. Children ran in arcs instead of straight lines. Dogs barked at sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. The center of the town, still known as the listening court, had long since lost its mosaic tiles. But the raised platform remained, shallow dome supported by carved arches, its bricks rubbed, smoothed by wind and time travelers left pebbles on the steps, a ritual with no origin. Some said it honored her. Others said it silenced the ground beneath. Either way, the pebbles stayed, arranged in uneven clusters, not offerings, exactly, but punctuation. And then there were the doorways. Asterisk, every house in Duranahita had one feature in common. The threshold was slightly raised, forcing the person entering to pause, not by height, but by rhythm. To enter a home, you had to lift your foot just slightly higher than usual. This design, rare in Persian domestic architecture, had no known function, but it persisted. Some said it was to encourage silence before speech. Others claimed it mimicked the way Shahbahang had stepped over the palace threshold when she first escaped. Careful, deliberate, unseen. Of course, not all stories can survive so many generations without fraying. Asterisk, by the 10th century, Kahung had begun to morph into something else. She was no longer just the concubine who escaped. She became a saint of echoes, a symbol of escape without arrival. In desert poetry, her name came to represent longing deferred. A scholar of the Bayat period, Amukafa wrote, Darren is not a place, but a sound that forgot its source. Shahbahang is not a woman, but the breath between silence and voice. In folk tales, she was said to have sung to the mountains, to have walked backwards through gates so that no one could follow, to have carried a flame in her throat that lit each stone she stepped on. One tale claimed she became a bird, another a shadow that turned water to ink, and always she remained just out of reach. Yet something tangible lingered in 1213 CE. A Casban merchant named Ada ibn Rahim passed through the town and noted something strange in his travelogue. At noon, when the sun strikes the stones evenly, the houses hum. Not loud, not tuneful, but as if the air remembers being a song. He also described meeting an old man who claimed to be the last hereditary guardian of the listening court, a man whose family had for centuries maintained the silence of the inner plaza, not by rule, not by force, but by tending the space like a garden of air. The guardian told him, she is not gone. She is the pattern. When the stars align again and the voice returns, the town will remember how to listen. Ata Ibn Rahim wrote this down skeptically, yet included a sketch of the central dome. On the underside of its arches, he claimed, were carvings, shallow, worn, and faint. Not decorative, not sacred texts, but lines, 5 of them, parallel, running in a wave, like a musical staff. If true, it would suggest that the town was not just built to remember Shahbahang's escape, but to record it, not in stone, in resonance. This brings us to the theory proposed much later, in the 20th century, by a Persian acoustician named Dr. Beros Kadimi. He believed that the town had been designed using passive acoustic architecture structures, meant to carry, trap, and reflect sound in deliberate patterns. Dr. Kadami's team conducted low-frequency sweeps of the ruins and discovered that certain positions within the listening court amplified specific frequencies, not random ones. Specific tones in the scale used in Zoroastrian temple chanting, the Dadai and mode. Even more curious, one position, directly beneath the central arch, absorbed sound completely. A null zone, no echo, reverberation. The sound vanished into the stone. In his notes, Kadimi wrote, this is not a mistake of structure. It is a design of memory, a place for a voice to return to. The implications are staggering. Darren was built to preserve a voice, not words, not image, but tone. Then it is less a town and more a musical instrument, one that has been strung and tuned, yet never played, or perhaps played once, and now waits eternally for the echo to complete its cycle to the people who live nearby today. The ruins are just ruins, beautiful, strange, quiet. They sweep dust from the arch once a year. They nod at tourists. They do not speak the old names, but still, the patterns remain. The way shadows fall, the way footsteps pause, the way even loud voices soften near the dome. And sometimes, at dusk, when the wind is just right, the pebbles on the central steps clink against one another, not from animals, not from birds, not from movement, just vibration, a frequency without source, a memory without mouth. And when someone new asks why the town was built here, why a settlement existed in the middle of nowhere, shaped like a spiral, with no central market and no city wall, the elders shrugged and offered the only answer anyone has ever needed. She was heading this way, so we built the town to wait for her. Asterisk, there is no record of anyone ever hearing Shabahang again. No official scroll, no priestly letter, no triumphant inscription carved into stone. Yet, the town stood. For centuries, Danianahita was not abandoned all at once. It faded, slowly, not because of war, not from plague, simply from stillness. Trade routes shifted, populations thinned. But unlike other settlements that shrank to dust or were swallowed by newer cities, Darren did not collapse. It lingered, gently refusing to become something else. Perhaps because the people believed it still had a purpose. There's an old tale told in nearby villages, never written down, always spoken at the edge of a lantern's light. It says that once, only once, the town did sing dot, not as a metaphor, not in memory, but literally. A desert storm had passed through, one of those high, dry windstorms that rolls over the flat earth like a carpet of sound. And in the strange pressure that followed, the dome at the center of Darren began to hum. A low note, sustained, no source, no breeze, just vibration. The people gathered, quietly. No one spoke. They stood in a wide circle, hands at their sides, heads turned toward the stone platform. And the sound grew, layered, like multiple voices overlapping, some high, some deep, all in harmony. No melody, no lyrics, just the architecture remembering, and then, just as suddenly, silence. Not one bird, not one breath. The villagers say that the echo continued, but only underground, into the stones, into the cracked clay, into the ribs of the old buildings, the bones of those who had listened. That it sank like water into dry roots and kept echoing inward, where no one could follow. But of course, that's only a story. More practical scholars believe the town's acoustics, combined with geological shifts, caused a natural resonance effect, an accidental sound, a pressure change, a trick of wind. And perhaps they are right, but it does not explain the carvings. In 1989, an architectural historian named Lele Moshieri visited the site and made detailed rubbings of the interior dome, where sunlight rarely reached. What she uncovered was astonishing. A faint grid of lines etched into the plaster, not ornamental, not linguistic. When traced and digitally mapped, the lines matched the contours of a sound wave, not random. A waveform, one that resembled human voice frequency, specifically a female register, low, steady, vibrato-free, a tone sustained, without modulation. It matched the profile of a chant. Was it Shabahang's voice? Unlikely, but the carving meant someone believed it was worth recording. Not in text, not in story, but in vibration. This discovery reignited interest in Darren. Team from Tehran's University proposed a theory that the town was not only acoustically designed, but that it had been used to train listeners, temple novices who practiced sacred hearing, not to hear instructions or scriptures, but to hear space itself, to sit in silence until resonance revealed something deeper, a form of devotion through attention, which brings us back to the platform. It remains intact, a single raised surface of stone, surrounded by worn tiles and weathered dust. No altar, no icon, no offering dish, just the stone. Visitors step round it. No one climbs. Even children avoid it, unprompted. One researcher described it as socially magnetic, but physically repellent. People are drawn to it, but they do not touch. Because in some quiet corner of the mind, the one that still believes in patterns, in breath, in sound that lingers, the platform is not empty. It is waiting for someone to return or for someone new to listen. But perhaps it was never meant to be used again. Perhaps the town sang once, not as a memory, not as a ritual, but as an act of release. A final breath from a woman whose voice had been taken from her, given back, not in words, Kel, but in structure. A voice so powerful that an entire town had to be built to wait for it. And even if it never came, the waiting became its own kind of worship. Because sometimes, remember someone? You don't build a statue. You don't carve their name. You don't even speak aloud. You build space for their voice. You shape walls to carry their tone. You raise a platform, not for arrival, but for return. And you leave it empty, not in mourning, but in hope. Asterisk. Before it was Kyoto, it was Heiankyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. It's laid out in precise symmetry, modeled after the great Tang city of Chang'an. The city was designed in 794 CE to bring cosmic balance to the Empire of Japan. Its roads aligned with the stars. Its gates mirrored the seasons. Its temples followed the rhythm of heaven. And at its center was a single being, one that builders refused to touch for 9 days straight. The official records say nothing unusual happened during construction. The Emperor Kanmu had ordered the capital moved from Nagaka to a new site, away from bad omens, political unrest, and floods. His architects selected a gently sloping plain between rivers, where mists rose clean in the morning and the earth was firm enough for permanence. But buried deep in a temple's founding scroll, the rarely consulted Shishinden ledger, lies an entry that stands out. It's just 3 lines. Main beam refused to set. Ground resisted. Twice. Woman found beneath kept in place. That's all it says. No name, no elaboration. But for centuries afterward, certain builders in Kyoto referred to the area near the imperial palace as Ononora, the woman's underside. A name never explained. Later, in the Edo period, folklorists would embellish this into legend. They said she was a priestess, or a peasant, or a punishment. Some said she volunteered. Others said she was taken. The stories agree on one thing. She was buried alive to anchor the city, not figuratively, literally, in old Japanese construction. Rituals. There is a term, hitobashira, human pillar. In times of great importance, bridges, castles, cities, some believed that a living person could be entombed beneath a foundational beam to stabilize the structure, to give it spirit, to bind it to the earth. Most historians agree the practice was rare, possibly symbolic, and mostly referenced in later literature. But the tale of the Kyoto woman lingers because of one detail, the beam itself. Asterisk. Even now, centuries later, Kapanas whisper about a particular support beam under the old Shishinden Hall, the throne room of the imperial palace. It is older than the rest, darker. It's said to make no sound when tapped, no echo, as if the wood were absorbing sound, not carrying it. This detail appears again and again in 1612. A monk visiting from Mount Kia described hearing prayers softly returned when meditating near the northern foundation of the Shishinden. He noted, "I spoke sutras aloud. The final syllables came back, not as echo, but as breath, not mine." In 1857, during a fire that scorched part of the palace, one section of the foundation remained mysteriously untouched. The flames circled but never crossed a particular quadrant. A court journal notes this with a single line: "The place of the buried woman she still holds." But who was she? Here, the records go silent, or evasive. In the margins of a late Heian courtier's diary, Fujiwara no Kiyasuka, there is a poem scrawled sideways, likely never meant to be read. She was not chosen. she was returned. The earth accepted her because she remembered the shape of stillness. Some interpret this as a metaphor, a poetic nod to the city's spiritual foundation. Others suspect it references a real woman, perhaps one tied to an older shrine that was raised to make way for the capital. A shrine that honored a Kamiya spirit who required not worship, but presence, living presence. One theory claims that the woman was a shrine maiden from the oldest settlement of Kodono, which had existed on the same plain before Heian-kyo was built. As imperial orders flattened older villages, some priests and priestesses resisted. It is said that one maiden refused to leave, that she sat beneath the tree that marked her shrine's center and said, "I will stay. Build your city over me, and I will hold it still." The builders obliged. Whether true or not, the idea took hold. From that point forward, the imperial palace was believed to be anchored by breath. Not stone, not pillar, but breath held still in the earth. And certain rituals continued even after the original being was replaced. Each spring, quiet ceremony is still performed within the palace grounds. It is not listed publicly, but in documents maintained by the Imperial Household Agency. There is reference to an annual Mizuwa Toshi, a water release performed near the northwest quadrant of the Shishinden base. The ritual is simple. A bowl of fresh water is poured at dawn into a shallow depression in the earth. No words spoken, no crowd, just two attendants. One watches the ground, the other listens, and it is said, though never recorded officially, that sometimes the water pools longer than expected, that it does not sink into the soil immediately, that it rests, as if the ground is holding its breath. And perhaps it is, because whether a woman was truly buried beneath the beam or not, the city behaves as if she was dotted. Kyoto has seen fires, floods, wars, earthquakes, but the palace core, the Shishinden, has endured, rebuilt, yes, restored, but always in the same place, always with the same quiet reverence toward that northern beam. No records state it outright, but carpenters leave it for last. Monks bow as they pass it. Tourists are never told why the gravel there is darker, but it is, and if you kneel beside it just after a rain, you may notice something else. The wood smells different. Not musty, not burned, sweet, earthy, still like silence that has been sitting too long without being spoken to. Asterisk, the city of Kyoto would go on to become a symbol of refinement, of delicate arts, ritual, elegance, restraint, but beneath its careful gardens and poetry-filled palaces, a different current always ran, one of quiet tension, of things held back beneath the perfumes and incense, a hum of caution. And nowhere was this more present than beneath the Shishinden, the Hall of State, where a single foundation beam refused to rot as the centuries passed. Generations of woodworkers and masons attended to the palace's repair. Earthquakes came, buildings tilted. Sections of the outer structures were rebuilt or replaced entirely. But not the north beam. It remained in the Edo period, when fire struck yet again, as it so often did in wooden cities. The fire breaks held in most places, but according to a note in the Carpenter's Registry from 1792, the flame curved southward, wood blackened elsewhere, northern support unchanged, ash drifted above it, but the beam beneath did not warm. It wasn't just fire in the Meiji period. When imperial authorities shifted from Kyoto to Tokyo, many believed the spiritual power of the capital would fade. Temples emptied, nobles left. Still, the palace compound was maintained, carefully, silently, and always the same pattern. No excavation near the north foundation, no alterations to the support stone. Even the gardening around that section. Change, lower shrubs, less disturbance of roots, minimal raking. Not because of regulation, but because something lingered. Not all remembered why, but they remembered that in the 20th century, a Kyoto University team attempted to catalog the foundational architecture of the old palace structures using non-invasive ground scans. Most results were as expected: layered stone bases, subsidence along typical lines, hollow channels for drainage. But under the northern quadrant of the Shishinden, the data came back odd. Not inconsistent, just blank. No reflection, no anomaly, no structural signal, as though the machine passed over air. Yet the ground there was firm, denser than average. It didn't compress under weight. It didn't absorb rain quickly either. When pressed by a probe, the ground resisted and then held. One researcher, unsure of how to interpret it, described the phenomenon like this: it's like the earth has formed around something it refuses to disclose. They marked it as a null zone and then moved on. But word spread, not through academic journals, but through maintenance teams, shrine caretakers, and older residents. Some said the site was cursed, others blessed. Some said nothing, only paused when walking past. By then, the story had returned, once only whispered among old shrine families. The tale of the buried woman had begun to circulate again, this time through school children in a Kyoto classroom in the 1970s. A child wrote an essay titled "The Beam That Watches," in which she claimed that if you pressed your ear to the palace fence during the spring rains, could hear a woman humming. Not sad, not eerie, just waiting. The essay was discarded by the teacher, but not before a visiting folklore researcher copied the phrase. The legend began to take form again. This time, Shinto priests started referring to her carefully during seasonal purification ceremonies. She had no official name, but she had epithets, the one beneath: the silent keel, she who holds still. One such ritual, observed discreetly in 1993, involved an offering of rice flour pressed into a shallow human shape, placed near the base of the north wall, then buried again. The gesture was simple, telling. It acknowledged someone in Buddhist writings from nearby temples. Another metaphor appeared, a teaching story for young monks. The temple must be quiet, like the beam in the north. She does not speak. She does not bend. And so we were able to chant above her. But it wasn't until 2008 that the idea fully returned to public consciousness, sparked not by myth, but by a mild earthquake. A tremor struck western Japan, minor by geological standards. But afterward, the Kyoto Historical Survey team noted something strange. Monitors embedded in the palace foundations showed brief stress shifts across all load-bearing pillars, except the northern beam. It showed no change, not less strain, not more. No reading, as if, during the quake, it had briefly ceased to exist in measurable form. Technicians assumed an error. Equipment was tested, sensors recalibrated. Everything else functioned, not that one. And when a maintenance inspection was carried out, they found, of course, nothing wrong. The beam stood firm, dry, cold to the touch, quiet. And so the file was closed. But the whispers began again. Tour guides, when questioned directly now, smile and redirect. Palace pamphlets contain no reference, but local residents know. Shrine caretakers nod toward that stretch of gravel when sweeping. Carpenters, if asked, will say only, "We work around her." And still, each year, the water ritual is performed. A shallow bowl, a gentle pour, a moment of waiting, and if the ground drinks slowly, no one says why, but they all feel it. A presence, not heavy, not frightening, just unmovable, like a breath, held for centuries, a silence that agreed to remain. A woman who, whether myth or martyr or maiden, became the axis around which a city found its stillness. Asterisk, every city is built on something, on rock, on soil, on trade, on treaties, but Kyoto, some say, was built on breath, on a single breath held too long beneath a beam no one dares disturb by the 21st century. The story of the woman beneath Kyoto was not part of official history. It was folklore, unverified, no grave, no records, but it lived on in the way silence pooled near certain corners of the imperial palace, in how local builders paused before working on ancestral beams, and how every reconstruction of the Shishin carefully left one support untouched. Asterisk, even restoration teams, modern and scientific, seem to follow old patterns. In 2015, as part of a major preservation project, technicians used thermal imaging to assess aging wood. They logged variances in temperature, signs of rot or stress. All readings came back as expected, except one. The northernmost beam displayed an even, unwavering temperature, lower than ambient, exactly 0.3 degrees cooler than the surrounding air. Not once, but throughout an entire year, summer and winter, rain and sun, asterisk. And what's more, it radiated no thermal imprint beneath it, as if something within the beam was not warming, not reacting, just. The report was shelved, the finding called an anomaly of instrumentation, when new devices were brought. And later, the same reading emerged, constant, passive, slightly apart. One preservationist, a quiet man who'd worked at temples across Kyoto, wrote a note in his private notebook. There is no flaw here, just presence. She is not in the beam. The beam is in her. He wasn't the only one who thought this way. In the Shinto calendar, certain sites are marked for quiet days, times when no activity should disturb the area. Most are natural springs, ancient burial mounds, old battlefield shrines. But in 2021, a small internal document circulated among imperial staff recommending a quiet day near the northern foundation of the Shishin-Den. No formal explanation was given, but the requested day aligned with Nia Namesan, the festival of the first fruits, a ritual in which the emperor offers rice and sake to the kami in gratitude. Some say it's a harvest ceremony. Others say it's an echo of older, deeper rites, when offerings were made not just to spirits above, but to something below. Perhaps that's what she became. Not a woman, not a ghost, but a silent point in the earth around which memory had crystallized. It's a strange legacy. No shrine bears her name. No statue stands in her image. No poem survives in her voice. And yet, she's there, or at least, the shape of her decision is to stay, to root, to become stillness, not as absence, but as structure. Kyoto is a city of rituals, of tea poured slowly, of sandals set just so, of syllables chosen with precision. And what is ritual, if not the shaping of silence into presence? That is what she became. Not a scream, not a symbol, not a martyr. A ritual, a beam left alone, a breath held beneath the weight of empire. A choice woven into stone and wood and memory, and so the palace remains. Visitors come and go. Ceremonies unfold. Number, mention is made of her beneath the floor, and yet every echo knows, every pause between words, every decision not to rebuild that particular section of the foundation. In the winter, when snow falls evenly, and the city slows to a hush, the gravel near the northern beam darkens first, not from footfall, from warmth, not heat of the kind, the warmth of a space made sacred through refusal. And when the thaw begins, the bowl of water is poured again. The earth waits, not to drink, but to remember, because somewhere beneath all the lines drawn in ink and law and history, there was a woman, not named, not praised, not even mourned, only kept, not by force, but by silence. And through her stillness, a capital endured. Asterisk there. There's a map in the Royal Library of Lisbon, hand-drawn in faded ink on stretched goatskin. It's dated to the early 15th century, a time when Portugal was first beginning to chart the coasts of West Africa. The map is detailed, precise. It shows rivers, mountains, settlements, but just outside a red square labeled Snow Jorge da Mina, there is a name written along the edge, carefully spaced between compass roses. Regina de Fora, the queen from outside. There is no annotation, no symbol. It's just the title, not inside the city walls, but tethered to its margins like an afterthought. Historians puzzled over it for centuries. No queen is listed in the official records of Snow Jorge da Mina, the Portuguese fort and trading post that would later become Elmina in modern-day Ghana. No royal figures appear in the captain's logs, and yet the phrase recurs, not just on the map, but in letters, travelogues, and in the oral traditions of the local Fant people, passed down quietly through generations. The story, pieced together slowly, begins not in Portugal, but in the interior forests of West Africa, in a village whose name was later mispronounced and lost in translation. There, a woman was born to a clan of spiritual lineage, not royalty in the European sense, but revered. A medium between land and voice. She was called Abina Mensima, though her name would vanish from most records, according to the Fant version of events. When the Portuguese arrived on the coast, they did not only build a fort, they made agreements, and one of those agreements, perhaps to ensure peace, perhaps as a gesture of trust, involved a marriage, not a legal marriage, not a Christian union, but a symbolic one. Abina was sent to the coast to represent her people in the form of a wife, not to a man, but to the outpost itself, to live beside it, near it, as its human counterpart. Her presence was ceremonial. She welcomed envoys, translated disputes, blessed the rains before cargo ships departed. Her hut was built beside the path that led to the outer wall, not within the fort, not in the village, on the border. That was her domain, the threshold. She was never permitted inside the walls of Snow Jorge, not even once. The official explanation was religious propriety. No women in the fortress barracks, but to those who lived nearby, the truth was simpler. She was too powerful, because Abina spoke 3 languages. She understood weights and ledgers. She knew when the rains would fail. She could recite bloodlines across 6 neighboring clans. She listened carefully. She knew who had been whipped behind the walls. She knew how many barrels of rum were hidden in the western tower. She knew when the Portuguese captain began seeing visions after touching a certain idol taken from a pre-verdad. She knew. She never asked to be let in. That made her dangerous, so they gave her a name on the map. Not her real name, just a placeholder, a distance. Regina de Fora, the queen who was out. Her job was to greet every delegation, to pour water on the ground before their feet, to bless the trade winds. And when asked, she would offer nothing more than a nod, lips closed, posture still. But afterward, when the visitors departed, she would speak softly to the elders, and her words shaped decisions. At night, she lit no fire. Her hut remained dark. Yet guards reported seeing her awake, seated, unmoving, listening. The dogs never barked at her. The birds never nested in her roof. The rain always veered slightly before it reached her door. No one questioned it. The Portuguese began to avoid passing near her. They would send messengers instead. One commander ordered that her hut be moved a good stone's throw from the west gate. She moved without protest, But the new location revealed something odd. The walls of the fort began to sweat. Not visibly, not enough to flood. Dampness clung to the lower stones. Molds grew in patterns. And inside the barracks, voices began to echo, strangely, out of sync. A priest sent a report back to Lisbon, describing spiritual turbulence. The captain wrote only, the queen from outside has shifted her gaze. I request transfer. He left within 3 weeks. Still, she never crossed the threshold, and so the fort endured. Increasingly defensive, increasingly sealed. But trade continued. The queen remained. And the map preserved her name, placed neatly outside the walls. But she didn't stay forever. One season, after a long drought, Abina's hut was found empty. No fire, no footprints, just 3 stones stacked in a triangle where her stool had been. The elders said nothing. The soldiers said nothing. A new woman was invited to live by the path. Tea to declined. No one asked again. The Portuguese scratched. A new marking beside the title. Desaparecida. Vanished. But her absence wasn't absence. For years afterward, traders and sailors reported strange winds near the fort. Ships delayed for no reason. Ropes twisted. Cargo spoiled. And always the rain fell hard on the inside of the walls, but lightly outside. Locals said it was because the queen was watching from a different threshold now, one further back, harder to see, but still listening. And so, on the old maps, her name stayed, never erased, never updated. Just sitting, like a question in the margins. A queen, not of stone, nor throne, nor sword, but of border. She never entered the city. And yet, the city was built around her absence. Asterisk, long after her hut was found empty. Long after her name was last spoken aloud in Portuguese records, the fort still behaved like she was nearby. The walls, once clean and whitewashed, began to show stains along the west-facing side. Not from rain, there was no direct exposure. Not from neglect. The fort was still manned, still maintained, but the stone itself began to darken, as if it had absorbed something and now quietly released it. Inside, the soldiers complained of murmuring sounds in the halls. Not words, not footsteps, just a kind of presence. When the wind blew from the inland forest, it carried no leaves, no insects, only the smell of damp soil and the strange sense of being watched from a distance. It was around this time that the local Fant people began referring to her by a different title. Not Regina de Fora, not Abina Mencima, but simply Encina, she who does not step in. They carved no shrine, built no grave, but a small patch of land near the fortress was kept cleared of brush. Children were warned not to play there. Women walking to the river would bend slightly as they passed. And once a year, when the rains came late, someone would scatter ground cola seeds into the dry soil, whispering for the woman who kept our names safe. Why? Because her role had never been ceremonial. Asterisk. She had held knowledge, not written, not spoken, but remembered. She knew the patterns of trade, the weaknesses of walls, the fears of men who believed they had conquered new lands, but who still flinched when the air changed. She never challenged the Portuguese captains. She never shouted. She never walked past the gate, but the boundary itself bent to her presence. One Portuguese officer, decades later, wrote in a private letter to Lisbon, "The elders say she still breathes in the wet clay, that the fort rests upon her restraint." I laughed when I heard it, but then I felt it. The moment I stepped outside, the sky softened. Was she real? Modern historians debate it. Some say Regina de Fora was a nickname for a local leader. The Portuguese never fully understood. Others claim it was symbolic, a way to refer to the uneasy balance between colonizers and those they relied on but never respected. But the oral traditions remained consistent. The queen lived at the edge. She never entered. No. And because of that, the walls could never forget her. In the late 1700s, as power shifted, the fort passed hands multiple times. British officers came. Dutch clerks took over the ledgers. Yet the map still showed her name, always on the margin. Spelling varied. Reina, Fora, Fora Queen, R. de Fora, but the position never changed. Always outside, never removed. 1. British cartographer, frustrated by the superstition, attempted to erase the name from his official plans. He spent 4 weeks drawing updated schematics, refining coastal outlines, marking supply lines, but after submitting the work, his engravings came back flawed on each copy. The ink had smeared over the same area, the space outside the western wall. Eventually, he gave up and wrote in his journal, "There is something in the margins that will not fade." The Fant people, meanwhile, kept their distance, not out of fear, but respect. The patch of land remained empty. Even as plantations expanded, roads paved, and shops built, no structure ever succeeded there. One merchant tried to open a warehouse on the spot in 1821. It collapsed in under a year, not from weather, but from silence. Workers refused to enter. Shipments arrived late. Even the goats avoided its shade. He closed it and left without explanation. And then, during the late 19th century, a curious event occurred. A European missionary, trying to establish a girls' school near the fort, decided to host classes on the cleared land. She believed education would free the minds of the superstitious, as she wrote in her letters. But something shifted. The students, young, Fant girls, between the ages of 9 and 14, began showing signs of strange behavior. Not illness, not fear, but stillness. During reading lessons, they would pause mid-word and turn westward. During singing drills, their pitch would drop softly, as if adjusting to a lower harmony. And once, when asked to copy lines from scripture, several students began writing something else entirely. She does not enter because she does not need to. The walls already move around her. The missionary, disturbed, relocated the school. Within weeks, the land was left undisturbed again. By the 20th century, as colonial power collapsed and Ghana moved toward independence, the fort became a relic, a museum of trade, conquest, and cruelty. Tour guides explained its layout. Historians documented its faults, but even they avoided certain questions. Visitors occasionally noticed the strange space beyond the outer wall, not marked on any signs, not referenced in brochures. Some asked what the bare patch had once been. A garden, a watch station, okay? The guides would smile gently and say, that was hers, the queen who stayed outside, okay? The land still rests there, a wedge of open space beneath a sparse tree overlooking the Atlantic. Birds perch nearby, but never land in its center. Grass grows, then withers. Nothing is planted, nothing is removed, and still, the maps show her in digital archives, in overlays, in scanned reproductions, not labeled with bold letters, still faint, mark near the western edge, like a breath held back, because some presences cannot be contained in walls. Some thrones are not chairs. Some queens do not enter cities because the cities were built to protect their distance. In the moment she crossed the gate, the walls might finally fall inward, not from force, but from remembering too much. Asterisk, what does it mean for a city to grow around a person it never welcomes? For the outpost at Snow Jorge de Mina, later Elmina, it meant the queen was never inside the walls, but she was always in the gravity. Okay? Every corridor turned slightly away from the western gate. Every new addition measured its shadow against the patch of land where no building would rise. Even in maps, her name remained in the outer margins, like a comma that separated the known from the held dash back by the early 1900s. The British administrators had long since replaced the Portuguese. The fortress, worn but intact, still stood above. The Atlantic, once a center of trade, now a remnant of empire. One governor, trying to modernize the layout, proposed turning the western plot into a custom station. He sent surveyors. They measured, dug, prepared foundations, but the reports came back conflicting. One claimed the soil was too loose, another too dense. One team said the incline was wrong, another said it was flat. Measurements changed between visits. Compass readings fluttered. Eventually, they gave up, and in his resignation letter, the governor wrote, "It is not the land that refuses the building. It is the memory." By then, the oral traditions had grown quiet. The story of Encina was known by fewer and fewer elders. Children passed by the empty spot without noticing. The city had expanded in other directions. Its fort was a landmark, not a locus, but the space remained just large enough to walk across in 15 steps, just empty enough to remember that someone had once watched the city without joining it. In the 1970s, cultural preservation effort funded a local museum display. Inside a dim side room of the fort, a simple exhibit titled "Women of the Edge" featured a clay bowl, a set of cowrie shells, and a single map, the original goatskin map. In the quiet of the exhibit, if you leaned close, you could still make out the words Regina de Fora, and beside it, written faintly in newer ink, an annotation added decades later, uncertain in spelling, uncertain in tone. 2 more words, still watching. Perhaps she was, because something strange began to happen. Visitors began reporting a sensation, not fear, not wonder, but pause. When passing the land beside the western wall, they slowed without meaning to. Conversations lowered in volume. Cameras stopped clicking. A few stepped aside, letting an invisible person pass. One tourist, a linguist from Brazil, stood on the edge of the patch and began to hum without realizing it. A long, low tone. No melody, just resonance. Her travel companion asked, "What are you singing?" She blinked, confused. "I don't know." It felt like I was joining in. The story spread again. In the early 2000s, Ghanaian poet Ama Abogia published a short verse titled "She Never Came In," which closed with the lines, "She did not walk the stairs. She did not sign the treaty. She only listened." And the city turned its face away to avoid the truth she already carried. That poem was read at a local university event, then again at a protest, then again on a radio program about forgotten women in colonial history. The phrase Regina de Fora re-entered the conversation, not as a historical puzzle, but as an idea. The queen outside, the one who never enters because what's inside isn't ready. It was around this time that people began leaving small offerings, quiet ones, a folded cloth, a piece of coral, a single bead, nothing dramatic, nothing organized, just acknowledgments up the edge of something unnamed. Not a shrine, not a grave, just respect, because deep down, we all understand the geometry of distance, the way someone can shape a room without stepping into it, the way a voice can linger not in the center, but in the corners, the way a life can be remembered, not with statues, but with space left open. And maybe that's what she asked for. Not a crown, not a monument, not even justice, just not to be forgotten, just to remain in the map, in the margin, in the shape the city makes when it forgets to fill in its own silence. Asterisk in the town of Norwich, England, there is a small, square window set low into the north wall of a cathedral chapel. It looks like nothing, just a hole, no bigger than a loaf of bread, now sealed with glass. Tourists sometimes kneel beside it, snapping photos without understanding. A few might glance at the plaque nearby, whose text is worn thin by rain and time. But few know what the window once looked into. Fewer still remember what or who looked out. Because in the year 1321, a woman named Alina was sealed behind that wall. Not punished, not martyred, not condemned. She chose it. She was what the church called an anchoress, a kind of spiritual recluse. A woman who asked to be locked into a cell attached to a church where she would live out the rest of her days in prayer, stillness, and silence. She would never leave. She would never see the sun directly again. And the church allowed this. More than allowed it, they formalized it with rituals, with witnesses. With stone, on the day of her enclosure, 3 priests read aloud from the book of Psalms. A crowd gathered. A procession of townspeople carried food, cloth, a Bible, and a bowl of salt. The bishop blessed the walls. Then the masons bricked her in. Asterisk. A wall was built behind her, sealing her chamber. 3 openings were left. 1 small window facing the altar, so she could hear mass. 1 slot to receive food, and 1, the lowest, to speak to visitors who came for advice. That window, the one tourists peer into today, was called the parlor slit. And through it, for 32 years, Alina spoke, not often, not freely, but enough to be remembered. She answered questions. She listened to confessions. She calmed nervous brides and frightened widows. Men of rank and men of guilt came to hear her advice. Not sermons, not law, just calm, weightless thoughts, drifting through a space that smelled of dust, wax, and stone. But why did she enter? Why would someone willingly choose a stone box? There are no surviving letters from Alina, no confessions, no diary, but fragments remain quoted in sermons, copied into marginalia. It's passed down in prayer manuals. One monk wrote, "She said to me, the world is too loud for the soul to breathe. In here, it finally inhales." Another described her as the quietness that unknotted others. And so she remained through winters that split the chapel's roof, through plagues that hollowed the streets, through kings and bishops and new taxes. No one dared remove her. But here is where the story bends, because most anchoresses, even the most devout, had assistants, caretakers, maids, or young novices who helped maintain the space from the outside. They ensured food arrived, that linens were cleaned, that her health was noted. Alina had no one from the moment the last brick was placed. She lived alone. Food was passed through the slot anonymously. Dust was swept by a broom left inside. No attendants ever spoke of her face, and yet her voice was known. Farmers remembered her warning of an early frost. A clothmaker swore her whispered advice saved his failing loom business. A young boy claimed she told him the exact day his mother would return from the convent. But the most unusual story comes from a visitor in 1338, a woman named Beatrice, who arrived after a storm, barefoot and soaked, having walked from a neighboring village. She was pregnant, alone, shivering, according to an account preserved in a Dominican sister's letter. Beatrice knelt at the slit and cried, "I have no place." And from behind the wall, Alina answered, "Then kneel here. For a moment, this is the center of the world." Beatrice later said that warmth radiated from the stone, not like heat, but like peace. She returned every year on the same day. So did others, not in great numbers, just quietly, predictably. Over time, pilgrims began calling the wall the listening place. Still, Alina never left, never asked to, never complained, and then she stopped speaking. One day, bread was passed through, and not taken no sound came from the mass window. The bishop at the time, unsure of what to do, held off for 2 weeks. Then, at sunrise on a Tuesday, masons opened the lower part of the wall. Inside, they found a chair, a bowl, a stone floor, and folded hands resting in lap. Her face was turned toward the wall, not toward the altar, not toward the outside, toward the bricks themselves. They say the stone around her head was faintly polished, as if she had rested it there, over and over again, not in despair, but in comfort. They did not bury her in the cemetery. They resealed the wall, set a stone cross at the base, and for a while, people continued to speak at the slit. Just in case. Today, the wall remains solid, quiet, mostly ignored, but if you visit on a windless morning, just after the cathedral bells finish, you might feel something different in the air near that window. Not cold, not ghostly, just settled. The kind of stillness that makes you slow your step. The kind that reminds you not all voices echo. Some enter stone and never need to leave. Asterisk, by the middle of the 14th century, Elena's cell was no longer just a space, it was a rhythm. Even after her death, the wall remained untouched. People still approached it in silence. Not because anyone told them to, but because something about the shape of that small stone window, and the way sound refused to echo there invited stillness. The church never canonized her. No saint's day was assigned. But among the people of Norwich, Elena became known by a different title. Not blessed, not holy, but simply the wall woman, the one who stayed, and in some sense, she did stay. Within a generation, the stone around her cell developed an unusual sheen. The builders had used ordinary limestone, quarried from nearby, pale and grainy, but the lower section of the wall, the place where the slit opened to the public, began to darken, from mold, not from soot, just from presence. Hands pressed to it, foreheads rested, whispers passed through, even when the cathedral was expanded, even when new arches and chapels were built. No one altered Elena's cell. The foundation was reinforced around it. Surveyors noted that the pressure from nearby renovations was absorbed evenly by the surrounding walls, except one quadrant, the north wall, her wall, which neither shifted nor cracked. A stonemason in the 1600s wrote, "This one breathes differently. The mortar seems dry before we lay it," as if the wall had already prepared to receive, but her voice had gone quiet, or perhaps gone inward. Still, people visited. They did not know her name, just the story. That once, someone chose to stay inside a stone room forever, not to punish herself, not to be admired, because silence had become a place she wanted to live. Centuries passed. The Reformation came. The monasteries fell. Icons were smashed. Cathedrals stripped. Elena's wall remained. Records from 1542 show that a Protestant reformer, tasked with assessing the cathedral's superstitious structures, paused at her cell. He noted its unusual integrity, the absence of decoration, and wrote, "No image, no idol, just stone. Leave it." He did. Later, during the English Civil War, K, parliamentarian officer billeted in the cathedral, was said to have stood for hours in front of the wall, alone, and left muttering that he had heard someone ask his name, though no lips moved. Of course, no records confirmed this, but the tale became local folklore that even the most hardened soldiers softened near the wall woman by the 1800s. The cell was considered a curiosity, a medieval footnote. Victorian tourists photographed it. Clergy members tried to erase the superstition by removing the original plaque. A newer inscription was carved, identifying the space as a hermit cell, but the locals put the old plaque back. The original, simple, worn, carved in quiet Latin, Elena inclusa, Orite, Elena enclosed. Pray. They called her inclusa, not prisoner, not saint, not recluse. Just enclosed, as if that alone was the miracle. Not what she said, not what she did, but that she stayed, that she shaped air without touching it, that she listened so fully for so long, that the stone itself had become an extension of her breath. In 1927, a Cambridge acoustician studying medieval architecture brought instruments to the cathedral. He wanted to measure resonance patterns in different chapels. When he came to Elena's cell, his equipment failed to record a return wave. He later wrote, "It is the only chamber I found that absorbs all sound entirely, as if it remembers every voice ever spoken into it, and is still considering its response." And still, the people came. One woman, an archivist from Leeds, left a single note beside the slit in 1971. It read, "I am too loud for my own life. Thank you for showing me another way to exist." Today, Elena's name appears in a few books. She's not studied in theology courses. She has no official shrine, but people still write to her. The cathedral receives folded papers every year, left near the window. Confessions, questions, prayers, sometimes just names, tays, no addresses, no expectations. Because to those who understand, she is not a person, she is a possibility. That you can stay still and still matter. That you can say little and still be heard. That you can be bricked in and not buried. And perhaps, more strangely, that the wall didn't silence her. It kept her safe. Like a hand cupped around a flame, cupped a door that refuses to open because it already contains what you were searching for. A wall that stopped being stone because someone once trusted it to become a home. Asterisk by now. Few places in Norwich remain untouched by time, but Elena's wall has not changed. No renovations, no interior lighting, no painted plaque, just the stone, cool, rough, slightly darker, near the base where hands have pressed for centuries. The parlor slit remains, sealed behind glass, not to keep anything in, but perhaps to keep something quiet. She has been gone for over 700 years. Yet still, her presence shapes the chapel around her. The cathedral's custodians refer to the area only as the cell. Tour guides call it the anchor hold. But those who come in silence, not out of curiosity, but for something gentler, still call it hers. The story persists, not because it's dramatic, but because it isn't. Single quotes to Elena's, she asked for nothing. She sang no miracles into the stones. She healed no limbs. She started no sect. She died, likely of age, in a small room lit by candle smoke and dust. And yet, people remember. A German historian visiting in the 1980s wrote in his notes, "There is nothing here to see, and yet I stayed for hours." Something is being said here, but not with words. Over the years, patterns formed. Asterisk,